Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the series of lessons on the Victorian age and the Victorian novel. In the past lesson, we saw the Victorian age as an historical period and the main characteristics, and we looked at Charles Dickens and his work. Today, we're going to look at the mid-Victorian novel, and in particular, we're going to look at Stevenson and just briefly mention the Bronte sisters. Okay, so the Bronte sisters, I wanted to mention them because they are an essential part in English literature because they are they are one of the first women who portrays really strong female characters. So they came from an educated family. They had the luck to get an education. So they wrote different novels, but they all published their novels with different names, with men names, pretty much because they were afraid that if they published their novels with their real names, people were not going to read it, or they weren't going to be considered as important as other men's novel. So they decided to publish them with different names. One of the most important novels by the Bronte sister, in particular by Charlotte Bronte, is Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is the perfect example of the strong female character. She represents the importance of independence for women. She always tries to make independent choice. She tries to never get controlled by men in particular. So at the end, one of the aspects of the novel is that at the end, she independently decides to marry the man that she loves. And it is an independent decision because economically she was independent, so she didn't need to marry to have some sort of assurance, but she wanted to marry him because she loved him. And for this decision there are different interpretations and we're not going through them, but the important thing is this aspect that she refused to marry him when she realized that he lied to her, but at the end of the novel she independently decides that she can marry him. So it was really unusual, and it's really important because it was unusual for someone to represent such a strong character during the Victorian age and during that period. Another important novel, but we're not going to go through that, I just put some characteristics in it, is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. It's a really complex novel because it goes back and forth. There's a lot of flashbacks. There are different voices who tell the story. There are some aspects of the Gothic novel because there are ghosts in it. And there's the love that plays an important part in the novel. In particular, it shows the destructiveness of love. But both novels, both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, are really important for their portraying of women. But today I want to focus a little bit more on Stevenson. Okay, Stevenson, I really like his novels. He had a pretty short life. He was born in 1850 and he died in 1894 because he had many health problems during his life that he had to fight. So he traveled a lot, and those travels inspired some of his novels. But he had to deal with at the same times with health problems. So he's famous, of course, for his adventure novels, and in particular for Treasure Island. Treasure Island is it was born as a child's novel, so for children, because of course is an adventure story with many aspects of child's literature, and in some way it really is a child novel for children, but at the same time it's really complex and it has many aspects that are not, we can see, comprehensible for kids. In particular, there is the aspect of the complexity of the characters, and even in Treasure Island, there is the main characteristic of Stevenson novels, which is the dichotomy between good and evil in a person. So, and we can see that in particular in the character of Silver, who develops a strong relationship with the main character, and we discover his real self during the novel, and we don't understand him completely until the end of the novel, but during the whole novel we can see that there's something that he's not telling us and that we have to discover, and that he's not all good and that there's this evil. So it's pretty complex in this way for the development of the characters, who are really dynamic and change. But of course, as I said before, there are also important aspects of the for children, because it represents in the protagonist the main characteristic of children. So courage, wants, the desire to break the rules and challenge them, the desire to go for adventures. And of course, it goes through this main and most important steps that a child goes through in order to become an adult. So it's a pretty nice novel to read. So of course I advise it. But one of the novels for which Stevenson is most famous, thanks to which he's really famous, is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the novel that represents best the Stevenson's main idea, which is, as I said before, this opposition between good and bad in a person. So, of course, you know the story. There's Dr. Jekyll, who invents this potion, the serum, that can divide his bad side from himself. And of course, that is Mr. Hyde. And at the beginning, he's able to control it and to go back to Dr. Jekyll. But at the end, it becomes more and more difficult until Mr. Hyde prevails. And Dr. Jekyll is not able to control him anymore. So he kills himself. And by doing that, he kills also Mr. Hyde. So, of course, it's this representation of Mr. Jekyll, who realized that inside of him there are two different sides, a good side and a bad side, and he wants to separate the bad side from himself in order to keep only the good side, but of course that is not possible. And many people, sometimes the novel is read with a psychoanalytic view, so by saying that basically Dr. Jekyll is the two side of the personal ego. So it is the alienated individual on the personal, on the social side, so an individual that is alienated socially and repressed on the personal side. So this, they say that it's these two sides of the psychoanalytic view of the ego. So, but the really important thing is the fact that there is this dichotomy between good and evil, and also the opposition. What Stevenson wanted to represent was this opposition between appearances and reality. So wanted to show the two sides of the bourgeoisie, of the middle class, the middle class people who are in some way outside of their house and they appear in a certain way, but then in reality they are really different. So, and of course, by doing that, and by in this novel, one of the other main aspects is that he wants to represent the limits of nature, in the sense that, of course, in us, in every person, there are two sides, and there's a limit where that we cannot surpass, or there are going to be consequences. So I wanted to just look at some quotes from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that are important. Okay, this one first. He says, he's not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him, and it's not one of memory, for what I declare can see him this moment. So here there is this man who describes Hyde's appearance, and he keeps saying that he cannot describe it, that there's something beautiful about him, because he's an extraordinary looking man, but at the same time there's something wrong with him, there's something detestable, but he cannot find the words to describe him. I can't describe him, I can make no hand of it. And it's not that he doesn't remember, because he says, I declare I can see him this moment, so it's really clear in his memory, but he cannot find the words to describe me. And that is because he's a supernatural creature, so it is impossible to describe him with simple words, so even language fails him. And this is one important part that shows the limits of nature. There are, us as humans, we have some limits, and if we surpass them, we're going to have consequences, and even language cannot describe them. So the second one I wanted to show you is this one. Here we have description of when Dr. Jekyll transformed in Mr. Hyde. And he says, he put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, struggled, clutched at the table and handhold, staring with dejected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter. And at the next moment, I had sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall, and my arm raised to shield me from the prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. Oh God, I screamed, oh God, again and again, for there before my eyes, pale and shaken and half fainting, and groping before him with his hands like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. So, Yeah, before I said that it was the description of him transforming to Mr. Hyde, but it's the contrary, Hyde retransforming into Jekyll. But the important thing is the words here. It sounds like in the description there are two men fighting. So it's a really bad description. It's not pleasant of him transforming back, and it looks like both Hyde and Jekyll are two independent people who can exist on their own, but they are trapped in each other. So the very existence of the other person traps the other. So, and that is because, of course, one represents the good side and the other represents the bad side, and we both have them in one person, and they cannot get separated. So there's always this interior fight between in a person, among a person, and it's impossible to separate the two, of course. So Stevenson described it as this personal war, this personal fight that is really painful and has consequences. So that is, of course, because Dr. Jekyll surpassed the limits of nature, and now he's paying the consequences. Last two that pretty much say the same thing, and this is really where we can see Stevenson's idea of this duality of man. And he says, it was on the moral side and in my own person that I learned to recognize the true and the primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. And from an early date, I had learned to dwell with pleasure as a beloved daydream on the thought of the separation of these elements. So here we can see Dr. Jekyll's theory of human nature. He thinks that in every man there is a duality, and that, of course, every man is bad and good. In every consciousness of every man, there are both sides. And he always dreamed to separate these two elements. And of course, we know how it ends, and we know how it cannot happen. So here it's the same thing, because I learned to dwell with pleasure as a beloved daydream. It's the continuation on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all of that was unbearable, the unjust, might go his way, delivered from the aspiration and remorse of his more upright twin, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good thing in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. So yes, he wants to separate the good from what is evil, so that the good can do whatever good does without the interference of evil. So what Dr. Jekyll understands at the end is that in every person there are both sides, and the fact that at the end Dr. Jekyll is not able to control Mr. Hyde and Mr. Hyde prevails kind of shows us that most time the bad part prevails in every one of us, and the bad part is stronger than the good part, but it is balanced and it is controlled by the good part. And we need both to have a balanced life. So, of course, Dr. Jekyll understood that at the price of death. But yeah, I just wanted to show you these couple of quotes from the book that are important. I'm gonna publish everything on the website. it is all for today. I hope you enjoy it. We're gonna see each other next time for the next lesson.